I picture in my brain like a homunculus, like a little version of me that is the self that's controlling everything. In neuroscience, there's the default mode network, which is related to the prefrontal cortex. We tend to think that part of us that has an ability to control. I don't necessarily think that we have real control, like absolute control, but we have that perception that we do. We mistakenly think that we are that aspect of ourselves that is going from like the past to the future, or to the present moment to the future. There actually hasn't been anything that they found that in neuroscience that is like linked to, oh, this is the ultimate control center, and this is where like you are in your brain.
Welcome to the Mindform Podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Hey there from America. I'm Ryan A. Bush. Doesn't have quite the same ring as Kia ora from New Zealand, but sadly Frank could not make it today, so I'm effectively filling in as host. It works out because Lucas and I were planning to have a call about the self, and it's not exactly a debate. I think we have maybe not identical views on this topic, but certainly not opposing views. I don't know that a whole lot of mediation will be necessary anyway, but Lucas is a founding member of Mindform. He's been on the podcast before. He's, talked about his really impressive long-term meditation commitments and his interest in Buddhist philosophy and many other interesting topics. And today we are just going to explore an idea that both of us have put a lot of thought into and probably both have somewhat contrarian views on, which is this idea of the self. So Lucas, welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Me too. So I guess I would just start by asking you about this concept of the self, and maybe your background with it, your experience with it, how you came to your current views on the topic.
Well, I guess it started, I don't know the exact year. It was probably around 2008, 2009. I began meditating, and I got really into it. I kind of jump into things and kind of go all out. And at first, I didn't really know what I was doing per se. I just heard randomly through studies or whatever that meditation was good for you, but I didn't really understand the why of it at all. Through my journey, I started to, first of all, when I was meditating, I started to notice like reoccurring thought patterns, and just how crazy the mind is, and how it kind of jumps from subject to subject, and it's kind of all over the place. I realized just how hard meditation was. I didn't really even think about that going into it. And that made me question some things. I started reading more about it. I started reading about Buddhism, and eventually came to the idea of anatma, which is no self. I didn't believe it at first at all. I thought it was, like kind of wooey wooey. But after thinking more about it and meditating more on it, I began to kind of see what the Buddha was talking about. And I began to question what actually is the self, like what is this like ephemeral idea that we think is like legitimate and like tangible. And I started to think more about that, and I started to question, like any like good scientist. I started to like do experiments and try to like find the self and actually go and look for it. And to this day, I still haven't been able to find any evidence that there is a self. So yeah, I guess I'll stop right there.
Yeah. Super interesting path. So you're saying you couldn't find the self, and I'm putting myself in the mind of someone who might be listening to this and who's not quite sure what we're getting at. They're like, well, I can't find my amygdala either, right? That doesn't mean it's not in there, and I certainly feel like I'm a self, right? And are you saying I'm not real, or that my mind isn't real, or what exactly are we saying isn't?
Well, so the real question is, that's an interesting question. But to me, what I'm talking about, I think, when I speak about it, is the idea of some sort of a permanence, like something that is tangibly you and you alone, and that cannot change. And and I don't know of anything, like anything, that cannot change. Every aspect of my life has changed from when I first started to now. Now, it's interesting because I still like get caught up in those ideas like, oh yeah, I'm the same person that I was back then. But I know that I'm actually not. I'm completely different in like almost every way, shape, and form. My beliefs are completely different. My values are completely different. Everything has changed. And I can't actually pinpoint anything that is inherently like me and me alone, like, and then, you can get into like, okay, so for instance, like food, right? We can eat food and like our bodies absorb that food and create new cells. And then we discard that food. But when we eat the food, are we now, is that food me? Like, is that who I am? And when I discard it, is that like me leaving? Like what are we exactly like getting at when we say a self? And I feel like it's almost an impossible question to answer. Like, I feel like we have moments where we tend to, especially moments of, I would say, like, where you're having a super high in life of something. You're on cloud nine for whatever reason, and we tend to think like this is the real me, But even that changes, and even that like falls away. And I do find it interesting when people say stuff like that, because I'm like, well, if that's the you, what about the bad parts? Like, are those you as well? Because people tend to be like, oh, well, that's not me. Like when they have those bad breakout moments, like they get defensive and, oh, that's not me. That's not who I am. Like that was somebody else. So it is just this weird contradiction that I've tend to notice over the years.
Yeah, good coverage of a lot of this idea. So you touched on permanence or impermanence, which is a big part of this. Yeah, I mean, if you look at baby pictures of yourself, right? You call that yourself, right? You say I when you look at it, but how much do you have in common with that little blob that had no personality and just cried all day? Like, you can find almost nothing. And it's not to say you can't find, like, I'm told as a baby I was pretty, like, things kind of slipped off me. I was pretty resilient. I didn't like stay upset about things for long, and that seems to be the case still. So there are certain parts of my temperament that have stayed the same, but there's almost nothing that I can really say I have in common with that baby. And then you extend the same kind of logic, by a lesser amount of time. Well, yeah, 10 years ago I had a lot more in common with that guy, but I've also changed my beliefs, my values, my perspectives. Different inputs have come into my brain. I've learned different things, and that's produced a different person. And then you can take this all the way up to 10 seconds, right? Or 1 second, or however long. Ultimately, things are different inside of me from one moment to the next. And so we're kind of always a new self, right? And then there's also this notion of control that I think is important, right? People naturally perceive that there is this sort of CEO inside of their head calling all the shots, right? As if there were just one singular point in the brain from which all of our behaviors and thoughts and feelings flowed, right? But as someone interested in neuroscience, I imagine you have thoughts on the control and the monolithic sort of CEO self idea.
Yeah, like the what you just described, I picture in my brain like a homunculus, like a little version of me that's like the guy that is the self that's controlling everything, like you said. I think in neuroscience, there's the default mode network, which is related to the prefrontal cortex, and we tend to we tend to think that 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 part of us that has an ability to control. I don't necessarily think that we have real control, like absolute control, but we have that perception that we do. And I think that that's the thing that we think that like we're that we mistakenly think that we are that aspect of ourselves that is going from like the past to the future, or to the present moment to the future. And we're like a consistency through there, like a consistent line. But I mean, there actually hasn't been anything that they've they found that in neuroscience that is like linked to, oh, this is the ultimate control center, and this is where like you are in your brain.
Yeah, and it's not even just that they haven't found it, it's that we know so much about the sort of bottom up nature of how our actions and our feelings and all this are decided. I mean, there's a lot of different modules in our brains sort of competing with each other to see what sort of wins to end up controlling us in one area. And that's why we sometimes talk about inner conflicts, right? Like part of me won over this other part. I wanted to get work done, but I just sat home and played video games instead. I mean, that's very, it wouldn't make a lot of sense that you would be doing things like that if you just had this singular self inside your head that was calling all the shots. But you've got lots of different parts of your brain making these decisions. And yeah, I mean, even if we want to call the sort of rational controlled part of your brain the cerebral, the prefrontal cortex, even still it's relatively weak in terms of controlling you. And even still, there's different parts of it that are competing as well to see what controls you. There's a really great, really difficult book called Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit that, through very different means, comes to many of the same conclusions of Buddhism, but it just goes through all these rigorous philosophical thought experiments. It's just such a long book, but it just thoroughly debunks the idea that there could ever be this, singular, enduring, controlled individual inside your head calling the shots. I mean, it talks about like, what if your brain was moved into a different body and you swapped bodies, which one would be you? And then, you've got the whole rest of the nervous system that's still on this other brain. And then what if, and there's just like hundreds of these what ifs, and it destroys this idea that it made any sense in the first place. Yeah. So you've talked about the permanence, the control, the sort of fluidity in the way that we use the term self, right? When we sometimes consider it convenient to say the better parts of ourself are our real self, and the bad parts not so much. And so we use this term in a lot of different ways. But I guess what we're both sort of agreeing is there's not one coherent thing that corresponds to this. There is a mind, there's a brain, there's a nervous system, there's a physical body here, but there's not this thing we're calling the self anywhere to be found. And so one question I would pose is, why do we all sort of feel like a self? Why do we have to learn and question this idea that there is, a self? We all just naturally think in these terms. And like every language in the world, as far as I know, has like I and me built into it. It's not like it's just a cultural thing. It seems to be a universal human thing to see ourselves as selves and have this personal identity. Do you have any ideas about why that is?
I think you kind of touched on something that is extremely fascinating, which I think one of the big reasons why we do that is because of language itself. Language is, especially like nouns, right? Like persons, places, and things. Like those are objects, right? So we, when we're taught in school, we're taught that all of these different nouns, like, oh, that's a pencil, or oh, that's a car, or that's Jeff over there, like we're taught all these like things, and each thing has a name. And we tend to think in this language oriented way, because that's the way that we express to others how we feel and other things. And like that's how we actually like evolved. A lot of evidence about the prefrontal cortex and about civilizations actually like kind of points to the fact that language was like the driving force of humanity to like get civilizations. We were, hunting gathering tribes that like basically like beehives, right? Like in a beehive, like what's interesting is every bee in the hive is basically like the same bee. They're all like DNA is the same, but bees from other hives won't necessarily go to that hive and vice versa. And and like it's like they've got differences right there. But human beings, like we could be in a tribe and we developed this prefrontal cortex. We developed ways of communicating, and when we did that, we were able to communicate with other tribes and eventually create civilizations. So I think that's a big like driving force to it. But I also think it's just in the nature of language, like just the nature of labeling things. Like your parents give you a name, you're Ryan Bush, and you respond to that. And you grow up thinking, like, oh, yeah, I'm Ryan Bush. I'm this like object, or I'm the subject, or you're the subject, but everybody else is the object, and that's what people are. And that's what all these things are. But when you break it down, though, once again, they start to lose their boundaries. You know what I mean? Like that's a big thing, I think, is like what one of the things that like really kind of brought me to some like aha moments was like thinking about boundaries and like where boundaries actually exist. Because as far as I can tell, like boundaries are just completely conceptual. There is no actual real such thing as like a real 100% boundary. You know what I mean? Like it's just like even your skin, right? You could say like, yeah, the skin is the the boundary that's protecting me, right? But you could look at that defensively, like, oh, this is a defense mechanism, or you could look at it like, well, actually, the skin lets things in. It absorbs stuff. So, like, what is it? Like, once again, what like where is this? Where is this like aspect of you that is inherently you? I've made a one of the things that I've said to a lot of people is like we tend to think that our bodies are made up of like organs, bones, tissues, muscle, cells, organelles, blood, all of these things, right? But our bodies aren't made up of these things. Our bodies are these things. Like we literally are these things. We're literally the air we breathe, and we're the food we eat, and we're the ideas that we take in, like when you start thinking in those terms, like it's hard to stop. You know what I mean? It's like where does that end? Where And as far as I can tell, it goes on. It goes on to the beginnings of the Big Bang. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, that's a lot of answers, and I'm trying to choose which one to run with for this next thing, but I'm maybe we can weave it all together. First, you're sort of touching on non-duality here, and this idea that the boundaries we create with our concepts and our labels and words aren't really real, right? I mean, we try to draw a line around a thing that we call a tree and say that's a thing, but then we notice, well, it's kind of like buried in the ground, and there's like soil going, nutrients going through the soil, and then there's bees pollinating the flowers. And so to what extent can we really say that the soil is not a part of the tree and is a fundamentally different thing, and the bee isn't a part of the flower? And ultimately, if you take this kind of logic far enough, you find that everything we have a word for is not actually a thing. It's a part of an interconnected process, and there's only one thing, if even that, right? Which is the whole universe. And so this is something I've concluded as well, is the thinkers who talk about the self not being real, like it's this unique concept, I think are mistaken. I think it's not real by virtue of being a concept. And it's not any more real than or less real than a potato. The difference is, and you talked about how, it's just sort of by a process of language and learning words for things, we come to think that they're real. I guess the difference is I learned the word for a potato when I was very young, but if someone says they don't like potatoes, that doesn't really bother me. I'm perfectly fine with that. But if someone says they don't like me, that kind of hurts. And that's, I guess, what I'm wondering is this self thing, it's got to be deeper than that. It can't just be that we learned a word for it because of our language. That's certainly true, but our language is structured this way for evolutionary reasons ultimately. And I think you can attest to the fact that the concept of the self is unique in that it creates very different emotional experiences. I mean, that so much of our thoughts are occupied with ourself, and so much of our suffering, I would say, is caused by this concept of the self and different thoughts we think about it and ways other people react to it. And so, yeah, I guess what I have speculated about myself in my work, but I'm curious on your ideas, is like, why are we so obsessed with ourselves? Why is this concept so pervasive in our minds, and it has such emotional salience to think certain thoughts about ourselves as opposed to, say, potatoes?
Well, I think that a lot of it probably has to do with tribalism, because in our tribes, like it was not just important that you were a member of the tribe. It was vital that you were a member of the tribe, and like it everybody in the tribe had to trust you, and you had to trust everybody. Your life kind of depended on it. And so we, like, but to a different extent there, like going on the tribalistic like aspect of it, like we grow up in families and those are tribes, like those are mini tribes. It's like the hierarchy of tribes basically. And a lot of this stuff that like we learn it when we're very young. And a lot of the times we learn it when we're too young to even question, like, if this is true or not. You know, religion comes to mind. I think it was Aristotle that said, "Give me the first 7 years of a child's life, and I will show you the man." He he knew, that like those are your most plasticized years developmentally, and most of your big beliefs in life are going to stem from those years. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't get out of those beliefs. You can, but you have to have experiences to kind of contradict those beliefs in order for that to happen. I'm trying to think of an example, but like, let's say you're a super nerdy guy, let's say, and you have trouble with like talking to women, right? This is a really bad example, but let's just say, let's just play it out. You have trouble talking to women and you're nervous and scared or whatever. But let's say, and every time you do try to talk to women, something happens and it blows up in your face. But let's say if you then won the lottery, right? And women started approaching you, your conditions have changed, right? And now there's like, it becomes easier to do so because of how the conditions have changed. Would you have that same belief about, like, I'm just still this nerdy guy that can't talk to women after this extremely like prescient experience has happened? Like, it's going to change you. And sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I think like our experiences like do change over time. And like you said, we're we're kind of like in the present moment all the time. And the way I've been thinking about this a lot recently is that we kind of have like a death and a rebirth, like constantly, like all the time. And we're constantly like, a part of us is dying, and then we're getting reborn in each new moment. And we can like be in that moment and be present for it and experience it, or we can be trapped in the past, the the thing that we thought we were, or we can get like obsessed with some aspect of the future. That's something that's over there. That's on the horizon, but yet it's not here. It's not here in this present moment. I'm sorry, I know I kind of went off on a tangent there. I don't even know. I don't really remember the question, to be honest.
No, you already touched on a lot of good stuff there. I'll kind of go through some of it. So first, I think you're dead on that the sort of tribal social nature of humans is why we have this sense of self that's so persistent. I think, one, like you said, cooperation is really crucial. You compared it to beehives, which makes a lot of sense. But then I also look at beehives and I feel like, bees don't really seem to have an individual sense of self. They're very much just a collective, and they'll die for the collective. Like they don't even care, right? And so I think I think probably what explains this for humans has maybe some to do with the cooperation and survival component, but also, you brought up the guy who was nerdy about talking to women, and I think mating is a big part of this too. And I think that the social selection component of all this is pretty central to it. I mean, you think about it evolutionarily, each of us is a gene container, right? We're vehicles transporting these genes, and we have to get those genes into the next generation, right? We have to pass them on. And so since we have this pretty sophisticated brain on our shoulders, I mean, we're able to do more sort of simulating, right? We're able to have our brains constantly analyzing, okay, what would give, my genes the best shot at making into the next generation. We're not thinking about it in those terms, but ultimately that's kind of the math that's being calculated behind our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. And so if you had a person who was just completely ignorant to how they were perceived, someone who was just going around doing whatever he wanted and, pissing off people, and everyone in his tribe hates him, and, no one wants to get near him, right? That guy's not going to pass on his genes, right? And so it's much more adaptive for people to have this simulator running on our heads saying, do people like me? Am I creative? Am I funny? Like, and it's kind of unpleasant. It's kind of a cynical thing to know that your brain is doing this because it wants to pass on its genes. But fundamentally, that's, I think, why it's wired that way. And you were kind of talking about the benefits of sort of being in the present and the choice you have at any moment. And I'm sure you have found benefits from, distancing yourself from yourself and sort of identifying some of these illusions, right? What are the benefits you think it offers to someone psychologically to become aware of their false notion of self, and to start seeing what's really there?
So the big benefit, I think, is just clarity that you get with just seeing the world without like judgment of the world. I think, like you said, a lot of the times our brains are constantly running a million miles a second, and we're simulating basically everything, trying to figure it all out. But one of the big benefits, I think, is when you get into those states of like flow and what I don't know what the right word is, but you get into those states and you just kind of like are there and you're just being, like there's nothing to get, there's nowhere to go there. It's not that it's like bad. It's like it's it's just like a letting go. It's like a, hey, I don't have to do anything, like to I guess exist, like that's another thing that I think when I talk about this, and I've heard other people kind of talk about the idea of no self, is like they think that it means like non-existence, and that to me is not what it means at all. Like in fact, I think it means that you do exist. Like it's a very like, hey, you're here, like you're a part of the experience. Now you still may think that you're like a separate aspect of it, but like you're there, you're experiencing it all, like, and like you said a word earlier, a process, and I've always kind of liked that like way of framing it, because I think that that is kind of what it is. It's just a process and it's unfolding. And I think another thing too with the just kind of letting it go is that we when we do so, there is no like trying to overcome anything. You know, it's not like you have to do this in order to feel good about yourself or whatever. Like because when you just let go of it, you're just there. There is no way to like describe the feeling of being like 100% present, you know, like it just it's hard to describe, but I know everybody has felt that. Like everybody has felt that at moments of their life. I think a lot of the times when people do feel that though, they because they just drop whatever it is that their mind is ruminating on and they're just present. But then they always come back to the like, oh, what was that? Or I need to get there. Like there's a place that they need to get to. You know what I mean? Like it's not something you need to get. Like it's something that just is. It's always there. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, that's a lot of good responses to it. So the benefits to coming to see, you as you really are and not as this constructed illusion of self, are the clarity of just seeing, a more real picture of reality without judgment, right? The kind of sensation of being in flow and just being able to let go and just be, essentially, without constantly trying to be enough, right? And stack up to comparisons. Yeah, the idea that you don't have anywhere you need to get to. You've already got everything you need right now to be happy. I think these are all really, really valid benefits. And I would say too, just like a lot of day-to-day suffering is caused by, these illusions, right? Feeling, you get angry when you feel like you've been wronged. But if you aren't even a person, and the person who wronged you isn't even a person in the strict sense, you're just both processes operating according to, causal principles, mad about, and the anxiety about what's going to happen to you in the future. And we can get into this if we have time, but the depression of not feeling like you're a good enough self in the present, right? I mean, a lot of suffering that comes from this idea of the self that you can, in theory, just kind of pause if you come to recognize it. And that's kind of what I want to ask about next, is if there are costs in your mind to coming to see past this illusion, or if it's potentially a useful illusion to see yourself as a self.
well, that is the interesting thing is I do actually think that there is use in the illusion sometimes. Like for instance, goals, right? Like if you want to accomplish something, you have to have a goal in mind. And a goal, by definition, is something that you don't have that you want to get. So you have to make a picture in your mind of this thing that you want to get that you don't have. And then you have to, you know, go out and try to get that thing. Now, that's all perfectly fine to me. I don't see any problem with that. The problem, I think, that comes with that is that we attach ourselves to the outcomes, to the outcome goal oriented side of the thing that we want to get. And then if something happens and we don't get that, we get mad about it, or we get sad about it, or depressed, or all of these so-called bad feelings that we have. And that can lead to depression. That's like what they mean by attachments. When you attach yourself to ideas and concepts, because that's all it is. It's an idea in your head, that you're actually attaching yourself to. There is no like 100% right way to do the thing like that is set in stone to get the thing, like, and by the way, there's like all of these other mitigating circumstances all around you all the time, like sometimes you just can't get that thing, especially like within a specific time period that you might have wanted. And I can see that that can cause a lot of suffering. It's caused suffering for me. It's caused dissatisfaction, definitely. I also think that that's one of the reasons why meditation is so powerful, is because a lot of meditation is just being patient with your mind and like just watching, like just seeing it go through its like ruminations and coming to realize that, oh, this is just what minds do, and it's not like a bad thing. It's not a, I don't even think it's a good or bad. I just think it's just a thing. It's something that our minds just do. But I don't necessarily think goals are bad. I think they're fine as long as you don't attach yourself to them, as long as you're open and willing to go with the flow when things change. And you might even notice that your goals change even before you get to the goal, like it may be like, oh, well, I wanted this, but now these circumstances have changed this. And I realize I don't really want that. I want this now, you know, like that's perfectly fine. And that to me is being open to the impermanence that is happening all around you.
Yeah. I think we're definitely in agreement in terms of attachments and the pain it causes when we latch on to outcomes in our lives. I think it's a good question as to whether goals and attachments are fundamentally self-oriented. Because, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva supposedly was this omni-compassionate being who dedicated themselves to helping other people, realize the Buddha's wisdom, right? And helping improve the world, essentially. That kind of person, we would say, has goals, but they are not like self-centered goals. They're not, I want this necessarily, and we probably wouldn't call them attachments, but they did, the idea is that these beings could still work toward goals and be effective and accomplish things. So yeah, I think not attaching yourself to them, like you said, and not fusing them with your identity, not deciding, oh, I am this job that I want, and if I don't get it, it'll destroy who I am, right? I think that's very valid. Yeah, I think there are some things we want that aren't necessarily identity desires and can just be goals without the self part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess my view on the costs and benefits, I mean, I think we agree on the benefits of realizing the true nature of self, or non-nature, whatever we want to call it. I think the danger is that some people will subscribe to these ideas and they'll study Buddhism and they'll practice meditation, and they'll go about it with the goal of essentially eliminating or disabling their sense of self permanently. And this is a valid debate. I don't have the answer on this, but I wonder whether operating without a sense of self at all is optimal, right? This kind of enlightenment state that people have described very positively. I'm sure we all experience ourself disappearing from time to time, and it often is nice and feels like flow. But I also feel like some of the best times in my life were times that I was really proud of myself, and I felt like I really liked who I was, and I was thinking about myself, but it wasn't self-critical rumination. It was praise. It was positive. I was proud of who I was, and I admired myself. And what I argue in Become Who You Are, and I can't say I'm convinced it's right because I'm not enlightened, and I don't feel like I can vouch for that state one way or the other. But I
I
argue that
disagree with that.
what's
Yeah.
that?
I think you are enlightened, but yeah.
That's fair, but that's fair. I'll take it. No, I think I don't have no sense of self, is what I should say. I recognize the illusion we're talking about, but I also, from day to day, I have a sense that there is a me controlling the whole thing, even though when I analyze it, I'm like, no, there's not a central monolithic me there. But, my view is that the worst state to be in is one where you have a very negative view of yourself. You have these low self-esteem, this self-critical rumination, potentially depressed, because I've argued that that's what causes depression essentially, is this low sense of self. And then you can take a big step up from that if you can diminish or even eliminate your sense of self. So you have no self-esteem. So you're not depressed, you're not, experiencing this stuff, but you also don't have a positive self-esteem, right? And this is how I have personally characterized certain spiritual gurus. Eckhart Tolle, for example, for a time lived without an identity at all and called it bliss compared to his depressed state from before, right? But then in my mind, there's another step up from this too, which is, maybe you recognize that there is, no fundamental basis for this concept of the self, but you don't eliminate your sense of self. You don't try to turn it off. You continue to operate and you act in a way that would make you proud of yourself as much as possible. And you cultivate a high self-esteem, and that produces positive emotions, right? And that's what my experience has told me is kind of the ideal state. But then, you talk to people who praise this non-self approach. My mom actually told me about a time when she just kind of fell into this state that's been described by spiritual teachers, where for a few days she had no sense of self. She was out in her garden and she was just really, fully intertwined with the plants and animals and the earth, and then after a couple days she snapped back into herself, and she said that was like the best thing she's ever experienced. And I do sort of have to go back and forth. Is this enlightenment state of having no self better, or is eudaimonia, a state of a positive sense of self and self-admiration, better? I really don't have the answers, but I'm curious your take on all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a first of all a really deep question, and it's probably one of the hardest aspects of Buddhism that I've struggled with in my life. Uh, but so one of the things for me is I've constantly come back to the wisdom of the Four Noble Truths. I just believe that the Four Noble Truths are so like chock full of wisdom, and it's not super wordy. It's just like, hey, these are the things that cause your problems. And even in the way you described it, so if you're going to like eudaimonia, right? And you've gotten there, like, and you feel great. Now you, in your own mind, you could create this like, hey, this is the greatest thing ever. Like this is the peak of the mountain. But like eventually, like you're gonna drop down. And when that drops down, I can see how like by creating that concept in your head about this is the top of the top, that now I'm suffering because I've lost that and I need to get back there. Like once again, it's like I need to get someplace that I'm not right now. And until I get there, I can never fully be content. And I think there is a difference between contentment and happiness. I think happiness is like, hey, I've gotten, like to me, happiness is related to like getting something. Like it's like, oh, hey, I've gotten this thing that I wanted. And like that makes me happy, even if it's just for a moment. Contentment is like, hey, I'm cool with how everything just is, regardless of the circumstances. And I know that this drives a lot of people crazy because they're like, how could you possibly be content with the way the world works or whatever's going on politically or whatever, like, but the truth is that you absolutely can, you still may want things to change, but you can let that go and you can just be present, I think there is a difference. And I would say that it's perfectly okay if you have that goal and you like that like feeling of accomplishing something. Like I like that feeling too. I think we all do. I just think it's the attachments to the ideas. I've talked about this too before with like it's like the forever moving goalpost. Once you get there, you're like, "Oh yeah, that was great. That was awesome." But it only lasts for so long, and then you're back and it's like you're always chasing. And I don't necessarily think that you have to chase. If that makes any sense.
Of course, I think you're absolutely right about not having to chase. I'm not sure where this will lead exactly, but I've been thinking more and more about these like ancient philosophical pieces of wisdom and ideas and in sort of neurochemical terms. I know you're interested in the neuroscience side of things too. And to me, I've come to create this sort of separation where, what the Four Noble Truths are about largely is this dopaminergic thing, because dopamine sort of promises happiness. That's basically what it does. It doesn't make us happy, but it tells us once you get this thing, you'll be happy. And so when I look at this principle of dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness, I equate that to the false promise of dopamine, where it says once you have this thing, once you have a little more, once you get a raise, whatever it is, that'll make you happy. And so coming to see through that false promise and understanding that noble truth is really all about just stopping believing your dopamine. Stop, like when you have that feeling of craving, just habitually knowing, oh yeah, there's a thing that wants me to think it's going to make me happy, and it's not really going to. Now, serotonin is different, and this is what I think of and associate with eudaimonia, because serotonin has this, many call it a deeper kind of happiness, but fundamentally it's social. If we look at, even pretty primitive animals, right? Serotonin is regulating their social appetite. And I think it does have to do with our self-perception, our self-esteem, and our social esteem. Now, when I talk about eudaimonia, I don't necessarily describe it as like this temporary high, like happiness, like how you're using it. I would say I've felt pretty good about myself for most of my adult life. Like there's only been an odd year here and there where I haven't had pretty high self-esteem. And sure enough, I've been pretty happy. Like I've been between a 7 and a 10 on the happiness scale for most of these years. So I don't think that type of happiness is fleeting in the same way that, buying the new car, getting the new job, whatever, that dopamine thing that wears off. And more, I guess my point is I'm trying to translate these ideas into real, neurochemical terms. I'm not a neuroscientist. I know we often simplify and oversimplify these really complex systems, but I'm trying to see in those terms, and I'm trying to make sense of, okay, well, I think in a lot of ways, these Buddhist principles are trying to, stabilize our dopamine, lower our cortisol that spikes whenever, things aren't happy. And, I'm I guess my hope is that there is a mode of existence that maximizes all these chemical systems, right? So we can take from Buddhism the low and stable cortisol that we might call equanimity, but we could take from ancient Stoicism the high and stable serotonin that we might call eudaimonia, and we can maximize our oxytocin through this strategy, and we can sort of just adopt this perfect life philosophy or mental model that will maximize all the different neurochemical systems in the optimal way, and maybe that's the highest possible enlightenment.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Not really a question, I threw a lot at you, but
No, I like it. I actually really like the analogy about dopamine. I think that's like actually kind of spot on. I've never thought of it in those terms, but that's really interesting. One thing I will say though is that when you get too much of one chemical, right, like a serotonin burst, like that can cause a depletion, and then you're bound to go the other way. Like that, I like the theory. I mean, I'm sure if like you could upregulate the levels to higher levels, you could possibly find a balance there. But there's always that balancing point, you know. That is kind of what they mean by the middle way, you know, the middle path is like, hey, don't get too far on one side or the other, you know, kind of like it's very like relevant now with political systems and how everybody is jumping on one side or the other. And if you're not this way, then you're the enemy type thing. I mean, those things have been going on for since the dawn of humanity. You know, I actually think that that is basically the hemispheres. Like that's basically what that is. It's like inside our hemispheres is they're competing, for dominance, and when you kind of shut both of those up, not shut them up, but like, hey, they kind of come together and talk through the tissue that connects the two hemispheres is the corpus callosum, and a whole bunch of neurons are going through there, wiring basically, and that's where it's coming together. And I do think that when you have those moments of like clarity, that's kind of like, hey, you're accepting both sides. You're not going one side over the other. You're just kind of like being in the middle. I do think that there is something to the chemicals as well, but like obviously if you have too much of one, you're going to have a drop later eventually. Like it's going to happen, like just as you get, when you have too much dopamine, you can, or even like something like coffee, right? You drink too much coffee, you're going to get that crash eventually. It will happen. You'll want to like recoup the energy. It's kind of like a capacitance in like a sense, like a almost like a battery. Is the way I would describe it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's something I want to research and understand better. There's this book that I'm not qualified to write it yet, but I'm hoping in a few years I will, that has to do with all these neurochemical systems. And a major principle is what you brought up of habituation, right? Like you get more of it, and then you're past the sort of equilibrium point, and then it can only come down. So it's a great point, and I'm going to come back to that, but I just want to say, if you weren't convinced already about the arguments we've been making about the self, the corpus callosum that you brought up in the hemispheres, that'll really put it into perspective if you look that up. Because in patients where this has been severed, you essentially create these two different selves controlling you, right? And people's arms will get in fights and stuff because they really can't decide which self inside you is going to win. So that's a fascinating one. But yeah, I guess what I wonder about is how like essentially it's a gravity of neurochemical systems. What goes up must come down. We built airplanes that make it so you can stay up in the air, and I wonder if uh, certain life strategies can cause your neurochemicals to stay up in the air. I mean, I know back when we were reading Habits of a Happy Brain on Mindform, there were tactics that I ended up writing about and calling habituation hacking, and things like novelty and challenge can essentially create they can essentially keep your dopamine from crashing, like we've said. So if you find ways to bring novelty into your days, right? If you try to keep the things you're working on in the Goldilocks zone of challenge between, too easy and boring or too difficult and inaccessible, right? These methods in theory can prevent this constant up and down sort of roller coaster, I would say, in terms of your neurochemical systems. And I would just sort of add, there's one principle that I've written about that I think we need to bring into this, which is, I've called it the Pac-Man principle. But it's sort of a philosophy that combines the best of both of these attitudes in many ways, which is you sort of view your life as a game and you view yourself as a character in that like video game. If you think about how Pac-Man would actually feel if he was like running around being chased by ghosts, he would probably be terrified. You imagine most video games, the actual character probably not having fun, but we call it a game because it's fun for us because we know it's a game, right? And so, in other words, we're able to face these challenges that are engaging for us without the cortisol, without the stress, the constant worrying. What if I die? Because, well, you'll just restart if you die. But you also get the benefit of getting to level up this character, this sense of mastery and pride from developing a character that you're proud of. And in many ways, that's how I reconcile ideas is if you can operate your life like a game, if you can go into each day saying, well, yeah, I'm gonna try to get this thing, but Dukkha, I know it's not actually gonna make me happy. It's a false promise, but I'm just playing the game because it's fun. And the goal of the game is to level up my character, right? Cultivate my virtues. You can imagine little stat bars. And I'm going to play this game to the best of my ability, try to build the best character, the most admirable person that I can. And I'm going to fail and I'm not going to get everything I want. And I'll just kind of restart until it's final game over. But to me, in many ways, that captures the best of these different philosophies and potentially provides a way to optimize all these different neurochemical systems at play in our brains.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I kind of love it. I like it a lot. Yeah, it's interesting. I like it. It's funny because I think for a while I got caught up in like the idea like behind uh like no self and like hey, like anybody that ever like talked in the concept of self, I would like almost like have to correct them and like hey, like no, you're not a self or whatever. But that in itself, doing that is a form of like, you know what I mean? That is a form of like getting caught by it, you know? Like, and I think like learning to even let go of something like that is super empowering, which is strange to say because you would think that you wouldn't like, like have more power. Who is there to have more power? But I do think that like what I've come to realize lately, I think, is that it's okay for people to be on their wherever they're at, and like they're learning at their rate, at their progression, and another thing that I would say too is like if you were to ever go to like a Buddhist temple and start meditating, like when you first go, they don't like give you the answers. You know what I mean? They're just like, "Hey, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Like, what's going on? Like, why you could easily go home?" And a lot of that is just because they don't want to tell you like when you have that moment of like clarity, like they don't want to rob that from you. Like that is like something that you get over time that you've developed and you've come to like your brain has come to like different understandings and that is like it's like a gift, like that's the only way I can really describe it. Like your mom, like in the garden, like those few days, like they're amazing. And I think anybody that has had an experience like that can tell you, like, they're all very similar, like, hey, this is an amazing experience. I don't know how to describe it, but I felt connected, and I felt connected on a very deep level. And I know that whatever happens, happens and everything will be okay. Like a lot of it too, I think has to do with death, like how we perceive death and like what's going to happen when we die and all of this stuff. But like once again, like who is the you that is dying, like I've thought this for a while that the you that is dying at our death is our conceptions of ourselves. That is that is the death that is actually happening. Like, but like our energy is just moving on to something else. That's what science tells us.
Yeah, I also think the death thing is really relevant. There's that phrase, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die, or something like that. Which means if you can kill this notion of this permanent, monolithic self, then a big part of your fear of death, if not all of it, will go right out the window. You've already died, essentially. That's the good news. If you're scared of dying, well, you just died, and there's a new version of you right now, and then that one died, and there's a new version now, and so that's all it's ever going to be. Nothing to be afraid of, really. If you're not afraid of the next second, don't be
Yeah.
afraid of when you're 90 or whatever. Yeah, I think it's a good point that oddly enough, you can attach the idea of no self to your identity and make that a part of yourself, and then start getting frustrated when other people don't know that they're not a self, and
Yeah.
then you're just repeating the cycle. So yeah, I guess the big takeaway, one of them for me, is use what's useful, right? Take these different mindsets, define yourself or lack thereof, however you want, right? Don't be afraid of ideas. Try them out. See what works well. Try different combinations. Yeah, it seems like they're afraid to even consider some of these scary ideas, like that they're not a self, or that, some of the ideas behind evolutionary psychology, right? It's like, no, explore the ideas, see what works for you. And in many ways, I think coming to see the self for what it is, as an illusion, has these benefits. When you are when you're doing great, when you're feeling great about yourself, maybe you don't need this concept as much. Maybe you're really content, and you don't need to remind yourself that you're an illusion, right? But when you're in a bad place, when you're beating yourself up, when you're super anxious about what's going to happen to you, and you're ruminating over all your bad qualities, well, just take a step back and say, yeah, I'm not really a self. It's not really real. So I don't need to make this, the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of my takeaway. Do you have any other takeaways, any other comments or questions?
I'd say that, like, for me, like, this is a testament to you because you started Mindform, and like I love Mindform. I think it's awesome. The we have monthly readings and different books and different philosophies, and we go through different ideas, and it kind of like opens your brain to new ways of thinking and new, frankly, ideas that you might not have heard before. And I do subscribe to the idea that, like, there isn't any one ultimate, like, philosophy, like, even though, like, I do really believe in a lot of things about Buddhism. There's a lot of stuff about Buddhism that I kind of find ridiculous, but for the most part, like, the main core principles I subscribe to. But I also, like, I one of the ideas that we came across in Mindform was Epicureanism, and I kind of love that theory, like, or that philosophy, like, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I know that a lot of people have looked at it as, like, hedonistic, but I don't really look at it that way. And maybe that's just because of my upbringing or whatever, but, like, I would have never have picked up anything about Epicureanism without Mindform. So I'm just really grateful that you've put together this community, and I'm grateful that we have the ability to talk about this stuff. These are things that I've been wanting to talk to with people for years. I try to talk to my coworkers about this sometimes, and they're like, "No, dude, stop."
Yeah, man. I'm grateful to have you in the community, and yeah, I'm grateful that we get to have these conversations as well. Yeah, you can join Mindform a Buddhist, and you'll come out a Buddha-Curian and Nietzschean psychotect. Yeah, I'm with you on Epicureanism. I think it's a super underrated philosophy. Everyone's talking about Stoicism today. Very little talk about Epicureanism, but it's just as misunderstood. You're right. There's nothing hedonistic about it in the material, kind of shallow sense that we think of it.
Yeah.
It's a delightful philosophy, and it's a very viable philosophy for life even today. So yeah, there's lots of that stuff that you can gain. And on that note, yeah, if you've thought about joining Mindform, I'm not Frank, and I'm not in New Zealand today, but I will be in January. We are going on a retreat there, and if you would like to join us, you can apply to join Mindform at mindform.io/podcast. Yeah, we'd love to have some of these conversations in person. Yeah, Lucas, it was great talking to you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform Podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychotechs, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.